Welcome to the Colby Cast, episode 64. Glad you could join us. Today, Bonnie is joined by Colby teachers Dr. Carl Hasler and Mrs. Therese Prudlo. The conversation is inspiring, as you'll hear, and reveals why our teachers are so highly valued at Colby. The episode was recorded last summer, so the hypothetical framework of Dr. Hasler's philosophy course is now a reality, being several weeks into the semester. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, liturgical musician, popcorn and podcast fanatic, and Colby homeschooling mom to 4 lads and lasses of middle and high school age.
And I'm Jordan. As a product of homeschooling, I'm proud to teach Greek and Latin for Colby online and serve as the Alumni and Public Relations Director.
It's my privilege today to visit with Dr. Carl Hasler and Mrs. Therese Prudlo. Welcome, both of you, to the Colby Cast.
Good day, good afternoon.
Thank you for having us here again.
Thanks for coming back, Therese. Glad to have you back. You've been with us on a few episodes, and Dr. Hasler, we're so glad to have you here for what we hope will be the first of many conversations here with us on the Colby Cast. Would you tell us a bit about yourself for those of us who haven't yet had the privilege of meeting you?
Well, about myself. I guess you don't want to know how tall I am or what I weigh. I have been a teacher of philosophy for, oh my gosh, nearly 40 years. I was stricken by ideas, I think is one way of putting it, when I was probably in middle school. I know I don't look my age, but I grew up in the late 60s and early 70s. Middle school, high school in mid to late early 70s. My brother's 9 years older than I am. He got an all-expense paid trip to Vietnam for a year in 68. Came home. It changed him. He got interested in Eastern religions, which was the hot thing to get interested in back in the late 60s, early 70s. And of course, I remember going to these strange bookshops in Dallas where they sold Indian philosophy and things like that. So I started reading that stuff. I was raised in the Episcopal Church. So I started playing with those ideas back and forth and got interested in what they were calling metaphysics and Eastern thinking. And so very early on, I was interested in ideas and knew that I didn't want to follow in my parents' footsteps of doing accounting work and finance and things like that. That's just not my bag. I also got interested in music when I was that age. I was the proverbial band weenie. played in middle school, high school band, and was very fortunate to be in an outstanding music program in high school. We won competitions all the time, and we were playing and performing pieces of music that other schools weren't doing. My senior year, we played Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. If you know that work, it's intensely difficult. It's intensely difficult. And I think we actually did a pretty good job of it. The upshot is I decided that I wanted to go to college, university, and study music. And right up the road from Dallas was North Texas State University. It's now the University of North Texas. And they had, and they still do have, one of the best public music schools in the country. And they specialize in the jazz program. So I went up there to study music. And I got involved in the program. I played in the jazz bands and I played in the concert band. I even foolishly did 1 year of marching band, never again. And, I studied music for 2-3 years until I got to a point where I realized that there were people who really had talent and I wasn't one of them. So in that period of time, I had taken some philosophy classes and I got interested in books, which is sort of a curse, I guess. And my fourth year in college, as I'm just about to have enough credits to get my degree in music, I decided, to my parents' utter joy, I was going to change my major. And, they were already a little concerned that I was going to get a degree in music. So I came home and I told them, I think I'm going to change my major to philosophy. And I remember my parents' eyes just sort of rolling up into the back of their head.
Oh, I love that.
They shrugged their shoulders and said, "Oh, you're paying for it." So, and that was back in the days where you could afford to pay for college. I took a year and I took all kinds of courses. I took government courses, psych courses, social courses, philosophy courses. And I was working, I was working in a music store, a record store.
Yeah.
Oh,
Here,
that's amazing.
and they moved me to a shopping mall in Arlington, Texas, just down the street from the University of Texas, Arlington. So I thought, well, I'll just change my school and I'll change my location. And I majored in philosophy at UCA. I got my degree. I spent a year contemplating what I was going to do. Truck driving didn't inspire me. And continuing to work in retail. Well, Siberia would have been better, I think. So I decided to go to grad school. I'd met a couple professors from the University of Missouri Columbia. I applied to two or three other schools. I really wanted to go to the University of Texas, but they told me I was welcome to come down there, but there was no money. I think one of the other places I applied to was University of Washington. They weren't offering any money. Mizzou offered me money. I said, I'm going to Mizzou. So I went to University of Missouri, Columbia, got my master's and doctorate degree there. Now, what's also interesting is while I was working in Arlington, I met this young lady who I got smitten. And gosh, we ended up getting married after my first year of graduate school and married into graduate student housing. If you ever know anything about graduate housing, it was
Yeah.
a concrete bungalow made of cinder blocks. And we lived there for a couple of years. And she was the reason that I ultimately converted to Catholicism, because my first year in graduate school, while we were waiting to get married, I joined the church. Beautiful little old parish in Columbia, Missouri, Sacred Heart Parish, and really had this really cool Irish priest, Father John Long, as I recall, who every summer he would go back to Ireland and direct plays in Cork. So he was just very much into the drama, the liturgy, and that was where I got my first taste of Catholicism, really get a taste of Catholicism. Also met a couple of guys in the grad program who have been good friends of mine ever since. One has passed away, but the other is philosophy teacher at the University of Nebraska, Kearney, Dr. Thomas Martin, good guy. So that's just a little bit about my life. My wife and I weren't able to have children, so we decided we'd adopt three children. We were living in Missouri at the time, and of course, you go to social services initially to adopt children. And well, to be blunt, they were color coding. White people with white baby, and we said, no, we'll take any child we can get. And so we got a little turned off on that. We found an agency in St. Louis that was doing adoptions internationally. Peru was the fit for us. So we ended up getting two Incans, and then later on, about 10 years later, we got us a Mayan from Guala. So I've got a Mayan, two Incans, and then I got grandchildren from my eldest child. She passed away 6 years ago from leukemia. And so I'm guardian of my two grandsons. So I'm in my second parenthood. I did 3 daughters, and now I have 2 grandsons. And that sort of brings us up to date.
Wow,
Oh,
what a
wow.
story.
I think I've been to that church in Missouri, like when we were passing through before. It sounds really familiar. But what an amazing story, Carl. I mean, I loved hearing all your different experiences. I have to ask you what your instrument was in college. Definitely.
I was going to do that too.
I was a bass trombonist.
Ooh, very nice.
Nice, nice.
Had a really, really fine horn. And unfortunately, when we moved back to Texas, we had to put everything back into storage, and somebody broke in our storage unit and stole my horn.
Oh,
I
no.
Thanks.
one 3 years ago, about $8,000, so I'm not playing anymore.
Yeah. Oh, no. No, those instruments can be so expensive to replace. But
And that's unusual. Bass trombonist. I have this whole personality classification system by instrument. So that's fantastic. Bass trombonist. I don't think we didn't have very many of them. I accompanied a lot of people in the department. The low brass players were always great to work with. They're very fun to be around, easygoing, had their music for me, kind of stuff.
Great.
Anyway.
I think that's really great. We need to find you one so that you can play for us sometime during our Colby's Got Talent.
I have no shop. I remember doing juries with pianists. Every semester you'd have to do a jury, and you go running around trying to find a pianist. You got time to do this? It was crazy. It was crazy time. I always enjoyed playing. It was the classes that sort of wore me out. I just didn't have the head for the theory as well as I needed, and we had to take all kinds of piano classes and other instrument classes and conducting classes, and man, I just want to play, and that was not part of the gig. And I got to a point where I realized I don't want to be a band director in hellhole Texas. And so, those realizations and the fact that I knew I didn't have the wherewithal to really be a professional performer was just more of the God telling me, you read books pretty well. Why don't you do that? So
That's great.
that was sort of how
Well,
I think.
and your story, I think, is so great for telling, how the things that God puts in front of us. We think that, we have a plan for our life, but you never know what's going to come and is going to direct you into the different locations that you're going to end up in. I really like that with your story. Of course, I've worked with you for a while now here at Colby, and I loved hearing your story about your children that you adopted too. I mean, that is just so fantastic. There's so many families out there that are really blessed by being able to do that.
Yeah.
That is just fantastic.
One of the neat things about international adoption is that you have to go overseas. And I would have never thought that I would go to South America. It never occurred to me. I've always thought, well, I should be in Europe somewhere. And of course, I've never been to Europe. But I've been to South America twice. I've been to Central America once. And those are fantastic places. Peru was just amazing. And I really didn't get to see that much. I just got to see Lima, Peru, and then in Guatemala City, and then a little provincial town called Antigua, which was really cool. Had a beautiful cathedral on the square. But I got to see really third world countries. I think more people need to do that, or so that would help them understand what these people are going through who are trying to come to this country. It taught me a lot. When you can't make a living, when the agriculture is dying, when all that stuff is literally going to hell before you, it's no small wonder that these people will risk their lives to walk 2,000 miles to come to this country with the idea that maybe it's a better choice.
Absolutely.
We think about at least my mother's side of the family who immigrated to this country from Ireland in the 1840s and 1850s after the potato famine, when immigration didn't have legality to it like it does now. I think a lot of people sort of forget these kinds of things.
There's real reasons, real hardships for some of these people. Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't walk 2,000 miles unless I had a darn good reason for it, you know.
That's for sure.
Yep.
So you converted, you said, when you met your wife. So your wife was Catholic. I have to ask, so were there any particular books or anything that she sort of gave you that, I mean, was it just you're like, well, I'm going to go ahead and study the faith now, you know, because my future wife is Catholic, or what struck you as being a reader? What works really struck you when you were making sort of that choice?
Well, there's more of a backstory to it. My mother was raised a Catholic. She was an O'Brien,
Okay.
a good Irish Catholic back then in Pittsburgh. And my father was Presbyterian.
Mm.
And they got married, you know, people often met in the middle, and so they became Episcopalian. So I was raised in a high Anglican church.
Yeah.
I was always sort of interested in Catholicism at arm's length, sort of interested. So there was that. I was an altar boy, and what we called acolytes in the Anglican church. So I had a reverence in a sense for the Mass, even if it was not fully legit. So I had that. I started studying philosophy, and of course, you can't not study philosophy and not somehow run into Catholic thinkers. And so I had run into some Catholic thinkers already. You know, I didn't have any difficulties with them. I thought these guys are interesting. So I had that going. Somewhere along the way, as I'm meeting my wife, and in that period of time, I managed to read one of my first Chesterton books. Don't know why, just found it, Everlasting Man. And I'm thinking, oh, this is kind of interesting. I don't understand half of it, but this is kind of interesting too. And I met my wife, and you know, one thing started leading to another, and we started thinking about, yeah, maybe we ought to get married. And I knew that we got a better chance of making it down the long road if we share the same faith. She was Catholic. I had a respect and an admiration for Catholics. Now remember, this is around 1980. We got married in 82. And there's this guy in Rome who's really way cool, JP2. And I'm really influenced by JP2. I'm reading, you know, Time magazine when Time actually had articles instead of commercials or advertisements. I read Time magazine articles about him. I'm going, this guy's neat. And he's doing the solidarity stuff. Now I'm into social and political philosophy. So I'm interested in what's going down. I'm seeing what's happening. And I'm reading about him. And I remember reading an article, and I use this in class sometimes with my students for different purposes, but I use this, my remembrances of this article. He's on a plane, I guess going to Poland, and you know, there's journalists on the plane too, and he invites this journalist up to see him, and he has his briefcase open, and I always comment, a pope with a briefcase. Now, how weird is that? Okay, he's got his briefcase open, and in the briefcase is a copy of one of Marx's writings. I don't know, maybe Das Kapital. I'm not sure what's there. And the journalist sees it and remarks, "You remember that's Karl Marx?" And the Pope's response is, "Well, you have to know your adversary." You know, it's funny. General Millet yesterday says, "Yeah, I've read Marx, I've read Mao, I've read Lenin. Doesn't make me a communist." Well, the same sort of idea. You know, back in the late 70s, 80s, it was chic in philosophy departments to be quasi-Marxist. You know, so we're all reading Marx and thinking all that. And I'm thinking, well, this is way cool. So all that's going on too at the same time. So I'm thinking, you know, can we get married? I'm not an atheist. I have admiration for Catholicism. I'll become a Catholic. So it wasn't so much that I had read things or not read things. I had read things that certainly were tugging me, but it was more my coming to an intellectual understanding that this is where I need to be. God calls in strange ways. So it wasn't so much I read something or didn't read anything, but this was how I was being called to the faith. Now, funny thing also, shortly before I met my wife, I remember one day driving to one of the Anglican churches in Arlington, Texas, which is where UTA is, University of Texas Arlington. Go figure that one. Okay. And I pulled into the parking lot because I was sort of thinking, I might want to go to seminary because I was getting close to finishing my undergraduate degree. I might want to go to seminary. And I pulled into the parking lot. I turned my car off and I sat there and I was thinking, I'm going to go in and talk to this guy, but I couldn't do it. Something wasn't right. Something wasn't right about being there for me. Started the car and I drove off. And so that was back then too. So I have all these different things floating around the back of my head. And, we decided we're going to get married. So it was a no-brainer for me. I'm going to go through RCIA and get instructed. I'm going to become a Catholic. I became a Catholic on Easter of 1982, and we got married in May on my birthday in 1982, 22nd of May.
Very sweet.
So
That's very sweet.
that's sort of how it all played out for me. So no earthly book that went, bam, oh, there we go.
But I think that's beautiful because it's those little moments that direct you in what you're doing in your life. And it's the quiet moments. It's not always the big bang moments. And I think that's something that's really important. It's something I notice that you impart to your students and to your colleagues, those little things that take you through life and being open to God's grace and being open to the Holy Spirit working in your life and that can direct you here. And we are so happy to have you here at Colby. So I guess this might be a good moment to ask this. So what led you to Colby? I know I've talked about my story with Colby as I was, homeschooling my kids when they were younger and researching different things and becoming really intrigued with them. But yeah, how did you find your way to us at Colby here?
In some ways, it's a dark story in my life, and yet it has blossomed into being perhaps one of the best things that's happened to me in my life. I was a college professor.
Mm-hmm.
I taught at a community college just north of Dallas for over 20 years. And summer 2015, I lost my eldest daughter to leukemia. So we go into 2016 year. And funny, right before the school year started was a Chesterton conference of which I gave a paper on Chesterton and Schopenhauer of all people. And if you've ever read Schopenhauer, it's like, morbid, but be that as it may. We go into that year, and it is not an easy year for me. We have a new college president at the time, and he has reached out to me, which many of my colleagues and I thought was very strange. The previous president didn't want to have anything to do with the faculty. He reached out and sort of made nice and friends, and okay. He has grand plans to change the college, restructure everything, and I get put on a committee in the spring for the purposes of hiring essentially people to take my place as an administrator. I was a department chair, and they were going to get rid of all the department chairs and consolidate. Okay, fine. I thought it was a dumb idea, but okay. I thought my expertise as having been a department chair for 15 years might be of use. Turned out it was just number crunching, so I didn't have much input on it. But I get on the committee, we do our work, they make their announcements, and I can see from my perspective that things were not ethical. I had serious problems with how things were being done. And I raised the issue, and I raised it loudly, and the president didn't care for that. And they came after me and another colleague of mine. Ultimately, I was allowed to voluntarily resign my position, which I did. So of course I had to scramble. I got to teach during the summer, but during the summer I'm scrambling, trying to find how to piece things together. Because at the time, again, I looked very young, but I was 60 at the time, and 60-year-old trying to find a full-time teaching position at the college university level is like trying to swim in the ocean with
especially at that time of the year. It's late in the year at that point.
just forget it. So I'm scrambling. So I call all the marks I know. So I get a position at University of Texas at Dallas part-time. I get into the Dallas community college district because I know some people there. I got a part-time gig there. And I call my Chesterton friends and I say, hey guys, any ideas? Joseph Pierce had taught for Colby. Joseph Pierce connected me with Megan Laniel. I wangle an interview with Megan, and she probably regrets it to this day, but Megan gave me
No.
I doubt that.
I interviewed with Megan. We had a really nice chat. She was probably desperate to find somebody, so that's why she gave me a job, but she hired me to teach literature class. And this is what, 2016? Yeah, 2016. Then the next year, they gave me a lit class, and Anne needed somebody to teach history, so I started teaching history. And it continues to mushroom. Now I'm teaching 30 classes. And now I'm teaching philosophy. God knows what I'll be teaching after this year, but it's been a blessing. It's been a blessing.
Well, I know
So,
it's been a blessing for all of us. Carl was an enormous help when we were redoing the History 11 course, which was as you know, Carl, it still is. It's a beast of a course. And we jangled it all together, as my kids call it. It went really well this past year. So teaching and sort of putting it into practice, I think. So.
Yeah, it was definitely a much better course last year than in previous years.
Yeah.
And
but, I mean, a lot of that is due to me calling or texting him and saying, what about this? What do you think about this? Because it's one of those courses, it's such a huge scope that sometimes I would be sitting there and, you can't see the forest for the trees. So you're like, okay, so you're fantastic helping me with that and team teaching it with me. That was really great. I've really been grateful to get to know you through our history department here.
You done good, and I'm glad I was able to help.
I can't tell you how excited I was to see your philosophy course come down the pipeline when I saw that they were going to offer one. And then, of course, the first person that jumped to my head, I'm like, well, I hope they're having Dr. Hasler. I hope he's going to be in there teaching it. And sure enough, there you were. Because I hear from the students, I hear from my son is taking you. He had you for literature past year. And I mean, he really enjoyed your classes. I love hearing about your book lists that you give everyone and your music recommendations. And
I'd love to hear about that.
It's a full course. You talked about this, that you have such a great love for a liberal arts education and the importance of putting that all together in all these different areas, whether it be literature or history and now philosophy, and tying everything together, that you're teaching the whole person, which I think is just so great. Yeah. So I'm excited. So how did this philosophy course come about? And can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, I'm not completely sure how it came about, other than all of a sudden I'm approached about constructing a philosophy class, and I said, sure, I'll be happy to do that. But as far as when it began to germinate, I don't know, other than I know that Nicholas Sens and I are sort of teaming with this. He's doing the homeschool part, and I'm doing the online in class part. It's going to be a year-long course. So Plato and Aristotle, a brief discussion on the pre-Socratics, and I'm trying to cobble together 3, 4, 5, 6 page list of quotes because there's no extant writing to speak of. There's just references, fragments. So I'm trying to cobble together right now some ideas that we can work with. They're going to be predominantly Catholic writers, but of course obligatory Descartes and a few others. I just read an essay by Joseph Pieper, who's writing it. He's a 20th century thinker. Just wrote a short little essay by him on the abuse of language, the abuse of power, which we're going to read at the end of the year, which I think I read 30 years ago, but obviously it's so apropos of today that it'll be a wonderful piece at the end. We're going to read John Paul's Fides et Ratio.
Excellent.
At the end of the year, and then people like Duns Scotus and Bonaventure and some Aquinas, of course. That's sort of the framework. I don't have my notes in front of me, so I can't be more thorough than that. I think it's going to be a good course. I'm really looking forward to it. We're reading a couple of things I've never read, so I'm kind of excited about that.
I love when you talk about like that you teach a course because you can read something that you haven't read before, which I think is such a great thing. I've heard my husband and other professors say that oftentimes they're so excited to teach a course because they haven't been able to really study something so they can really learn it. I think it speaks to being that lifelong learner is that you're constantly wanting to learn new things. It's really great.
Usually sometime during class, I tell my students something like, I'm in this with you. I'm here to learn too.
That's right.
I'm not just a so-called dispenser of wisdom, as if I am. I'm not. But I'm here to learn too. So the more you participate, the more I can possibly gain from what you have to offer. I'm always sort of approaching them that way to try and cajole them into engaging in the discussion more. But I mean that.
That's fantastic.
At the end of the semester, I'm reading 50 million papers, and I keep coming across kids who are saying some things, and I thought, wow, I hadn't thought that. That's a really interesting interpretation. So, these kids are showing me some things in the literature that I had dawned on me. So I'm feeling everything I can get.
That's great. That's great. I love
really
that.
Is.
So how have you liked, I know you said that this has been a real blessing being able to add this to your regular college level classes, but how have you liked making that transition to teaching the high school years and such? How is it different, or there's certain things that you enjoy?
Well, differences. The kids are obviously younger, so I have to be a little more guarded about how I say things.
Okay.
In college class, you could be more colorful. Okay.
Sure.
So good word.
I'm not colorful in that way. Probably good for my soul. I told my students this. I have students at Colby that write as well, if not better, than many of the college students I ever taught. Most of these kids, not all of them, most of them are better prepared now than kids I taught at community college and university. So I've not really altered very much how I teach class. Now, the criticism I get from my chairs is they want me to do more group work. I'm not a big fan of that, but I will accommodate what they want me to do. I've got to figure out how to do that more, because that's not what I did in college teaching. We didn't do work. But okay. I realize it's a socializing idea, and because it's an online school, it's really sort of important. And I get that, and I understand it, and I see it. I see the logic of it. So I've got to learn to do that a little more. And it's a little harder to get everybody into the discussion in a way in which I could do in a classroom of 25, where I could walk among the desks and walk up and down the aisle, because I'm very peripatetic, and it's really hard to stay stationary in a complete class. But I would be very peripatetic in my classrooms, and I could, stop at somebody's desk and I say, okay, now what do you think? It's harder to do that. So I need to work on. And so that's a little bit different, but really in essence, I'm not much different in how I teach at Colby than I was when I was at college and university. And really that's a testament to the students. Even my 10th grade kids, they were much better prepared than I expected. I really was dreading that class going into it last year, because I thought, oh my God, 10th graders, good God, they're so young. And yet that was really one of my better classes this year. I was very impressed. Now, I had a couple in that class that didn't belong there, but that happens, and I understand that. And last year was a strange year because of the pandemic, and parents freaking out about what to do with their kids. But that was a really a good class. I was very impressed with the work they did and their level of discussion.
And it's such a fun topic too for a lot of them too. I mean, ancient Rome is a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun for me because it's stuff that I hadn't read in 40 years.
All right.
Trying to catch up with all that too. So that was different, but I enjoyed it and I was very impressed.
Well, and I hear a lot from your students that you like to bring in these great discussion questions for them to really get them thinking, and whether it be in literature or history, and get them to think critically about, they're not just telling you back the story, but they're really delving into what happened, why it happened, what can we discern from these different topics. And I know as a parent, I appreciated it, seeing those kind of discussions and really getting them to think about it, and even so that they're coming to the table and they're talking about it and they're saying, this is what we did in class today with Dr. Hasler, and these are questions he asked. I mean, you really can see how that this idea of philosophy is really important in a liberal arts education, and I love how you bring it into your classes here.
These questions oftentimes are not premeditated. In other words, I'm feeding off of what they're saying, and I'm going, well, okay, I hadn't thought that. Okay, well, what about this? So, I sometimes have these little bubbles that happen for me during class. And
light bulb moments, right? That's what we call them.
I don't generally come to class with notes. I mean, in history I do, because I can't remember all that stuff. But even in the history classes, I'm waiting for the light bulb to pop up. Okay, have you thought about this? Would this have changed things? So, you sort of the counterfactual stuff, but not really. But in the lit class, I almost never really use notes. I may give them an introductory discussion, but when we're actively engaging in discussions about the text, I'm just sort of feeding off of what they're saying and how I've read the work, seeing how do you think about this? How do you think about Hamlet, as opposed to how I'm thinking about Hamlet's soliloquy? What's he really doing here? That kind of stuff.
So for some parents and such, they're going to see this philosophy class crop up on our webpage, right? Everyone knows, you take history at Colby, we have literature, we have theology, we have English, we have math, sciences, philosophy. What is this philosophy class all of a sudden? What would you say
out there?
That's right. What would you recommend to those parents that are asking, well, is this important, or why is this important, or how does this fit in to a high school curriculum? Why is this necessary? What would sort of be your advice to them on that?
It so happened I was reading Paul's letter to the Colossians, and where is it? Chapter 2:8. He says, "See to it that no one makes a prey of you by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe, and not according to Christ." So I thought about that. And I thought about that in light of why students should take philosophy. You can't know that you're being taken by someone if you don't know or have knowledge of the subject matter. Philosophy is at the very heart of all education and knowledge, if Aristotle's right. And who am I to argue with Aristotle, right? Plato would probably agree. So at the very heart of all knowing is the philosophical question. If you don't study the philosophical questions, then you're coming into the play already several steps removed from the foundation. And that's fine for a lot of people, I suppose. But we're trying to give students the wholeness of an education, to show them what the whole depth of learning is about. And so if a parent wants to know why philosophy is important, I guess the question would ask, well, do you thinking is important? Philosophy, if anything, teaches thinking, which is why it's a liberal art, or the arts liberalis, those arts which free us from our ignorance. And I mentioned that I was reading Pieper's essay, The Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. And what he's talking about here, in part, is the abuse of language. I'll give you an example. We talk about those awful liberals or those awful conservatives, you know, and depending on your political persuasion, you go, oh, yeah, right, they're awful.
Mm-hmm.
But be liberal, if we understand what the word means, is to be free of ignorance. And if you're going to be conservative, that means you're conserving what is good.
That's right.
From liberal freedom from our ignorance. And so philosophy, at least in part, endeavors to get us past buzzwords, get us past poor use of language, teach us how to speak carefully about what is being said, because what is being said shapes how we understand our very existence. Plato talks about two types of speaking in the Republic: what is said and how it's said. Well, how things are said is very important, but how things are said follows upon what is said. If we don't attend to what is said, you can say all kinds of things and it may sound great and you will go to hell for it.
That's right. I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I love that part in the Republic. It's very important.
So a good reason to study philosophy is to learn how to become a more careful, thoughtful thinker, and to understand the foundations of ideas, how to get at those foundational concepts. That's what I would tell parents if they were to ask me that question. Well, and I would say, and I would hope they would understand that.
Yes, it sure comes up a lot, that term critical thinking. We've commented on how that term too is thrown around and it means something than what the common parlance takes it to mean now. So this is what we're actually talking about.
Yeah, critical thinking, that's been a buzzword since the 80s when I was in grad school. We started talking about critical thinking. Well, of course, what in the world do we mean by that? Simply,
Yeah.
it means using logic and using good reason and seeking out the truth.
So for those of us parents we have enrolled our students in Colby, we have come to Colby for assistance with their formation, their education. Those of us who don't have much knowledge of philosophy ourselves beyond the buzzwords or, long ago sort of overview of it, or even a more secular approach to it, do you have any resources or recommendations for folks like us?
Well, if you put your child in a philosophy class, read what your child's reading. Start with the ancient Greeks and go. I could recommend, say, Coppelson's History of Philosophy. I have it in
Very good one.
I have it in 9 volumes, all the old image paperbacks, but you can get it in a 3 volume. You could read that, but you'd probably get all bogged down. That may not be very helpful to you. And you can find an introductory book in philosophy, and maybe that's helpful, maybe not. Pick up Plato and read Plato's dialogue.
Okay.
I love that, because I think that's really important. I mean, there are some. I mean, that compilation of the history of philosophy it's excellent, but you're right. There's certain works that you just pick them up and read them along, and I think the combination of all the things you're going to be reading in class this year. I know I'm going to be picking up a few of them while my son's in it. Even if I don't get to them this year, they'll be added to my ever-growing book list.
Well,
That's a good idea.
Students sometimes ask me, we'll be reading philosopher X, and they'll say, well, is there somebody else I could read that would help me with? And I said, I would rather you struggle with the text itself than to read somebody else telling you what they're saying, because already you're getting an interpretation. Make your own interpretation. Read it first. Then, once you've got a handle of it, then go read what other people are saying about what this philosopher said. That's the way you read. You don't read somebody telling you what Shakespeare says before you read Shakespeare. You read Shakespeare. And then you go find somebody who can tell you maybe what Shakespeare's saying. Or pick anybody else, pick any other writer. Pick any other writer. Read the writer first, and then you go and see what someone else says. Because then you have a perspective. You have to have your own perspective. You have to do your own thinking first. If you don't do your own thinking, then don't read the philosophers. Let somebody else tell you what to believe.
That's so important. And it leads back to those, reading these ideas. And that's what we do, right, at Colby, is those primary texts. Read those primary texts. And it's so important, because then you come up with your own ideas, like you said, but then later, if you do come across someone's secondary source that is commenting on it, you can be like, oh, I hadn't thought about it in that way, or that's interesting. But you, like you said, you have then brought something to that discussion. You prepared for class in a way, I guess, would you say?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's one of the benefits, I think, of studying alongside our students. What has been very carefully chosen for the Colby curriculum helps not just the student, the parent as well. Even if the student's in the online course, the parent can still get a lot of benefit from it as well. That's a great idea. So Therese mentioned the reading lists that you put together and your study music recommendations. Going back to that for a second, what's your inspiration for those? I love lists like this. I collect them.
Well, I thought about that. Father James V. Shaw, every book you ever get that's written by Father Shaw has lists of books to read. And I think probably one of my inspirations for that comes from reading Father Shaw. I met Father Shaw a couple times at Chesterton conferences in the early 2000s. He was dangerously smart. I had the honor of going to lunch with him a couple of times. This was in St. Paul, Minnesota, and there was this really nice little German restaurant off campus, the Glockenspiel. I don't know if it's even there any longer. But we'd go in there and we would order lunch, and we'd get these big steins of good German beer, and we'd sit down and we would talk. And Shaw was the kind of guy that you go, well, in this work, oh yeah, I know that work. He knew everything. He was scary for everything. One of these profoundly wise Jesuits is and I was very very honored to have the opportunity to sit and chat with him, and I corresponded with him a few times over the years because he had some relations close to Dallas, and just the nicest of people, and really an interesting man. And every one of his books has lists of books to recommend. And so I guess I got the idea partly from him, maybe some other teachers that I had when I was an undergraduate. But I've always been in groups of faculty where we talk books. I've always been in book groups. Why I'm part of the Chesterton group in my area. I've always liked to talk about books and talk about ideas. And so one of the things you do when you talk about books is you recommend books to other people. And so it's just one of those things that comes naturally to me. I did it some at the college university level, although I'm sure my students didn't care for it too much there. I started doing it in my Colby classes, got some good feedback on it, so I just kept it as part of my classes. The music thing is something that I do outside of class in just course updates. It's primarily because kids don't have good music today.
That's so true. Well, I just remember the first time I came across it as I was walking by where my son, he was studying and he was listening. I can't even remember what was the piece he was listening to. This great piece of I think it was a piece of jazz music. And because, my husband and I mean, we love jazz, but I hadn't heard him listen to it. I'm like, what are you listening to? He's like, oh, this is my study music. This is my study music, Mom. Dr. Hasler is recommending study music.
Love
I
it.
said, oh, I like that. You'll have to send it to me.
Generally, I recommend only sort of instrumental music. But every once in a while, I come across some old late '60s, early '70s folk music that I grew up listening to that I think is just genuinely good music, and I'll recommend that. I don't give them any of the sort of progressive rock music that I got into in the '70s.
Yes, I know the students. They've asked me that in classes. What's your favorite piece of music? And so I have a curated list.
Yeah, I have to be careful. I don't, there are certain artists that I might listen to that I'm not going to recommend to my students. But good classical music that I know pretty well. Good jazz people, people that I've seen in concert. I'll occasionally post those and updates for the students to listen to, because I just think it's good musicianship. I'm trying to expose them to good musicianship, more than just music that I happen to like. They ought to know what good musicianship is, because I don't know that they get much of that these days with drum machines and tape music where kids are just dancing all over the place and singing silly songs.
But I think it's so important. It's again looking at that whole person, right? I mean, it's not just giving them information and books to regurgitate. It's the entire person, and music is such an important part of our heritage and our past, and
edifying and uplifting, and
yes,
that's the way it should be. Just like good visual art should be edifying and uplifting. And if it's not, then you don't need it. So that's just sort of my inspiration for that.
I think that's great. Do you guys have much opportunity to get into sort of the state of music as you're just describing? That quality of musicianship is that's an easy one to kind of toss around also without really having a good understanding of what that is. Do you have opportunities to sort of parse out what leads you to recommend that particular piece? Does that ever come up?
As a general rule, no, it doesn't. And I tend to sort of refrain from that, because usually when you get into discussions with other people about music, it devolves very quickly into what you like and what you don't like, as opposed to what constitutes a quality musician and skill level. It's very hard to convince people that knowing how music works and functions and what constitutes a high quality of skill level matters when it comes to evaluating music. Most people think that it's in the eye of the beholder, that there are no really objective qualities. You know, when you get into those arguments with people who don't understand the objectivity of music, you're just banging your head against the wall. And I don't want to do that anymore. I've banged my head too many times with people who don't have a sense of musical composition and the structure of music and why rhythm and chordal structures matter and things like that.
Well, it sounds like similar to how you engage your students in conversation and discussions and thinking more deeply about their responses to the texts you're reading and the discussions you're having. What you put forth by the way of musical recommendation, that speaks to them in another way. And even if they don't pick up on it overtly, that over time, the more you listen to the recommendations you give, the students can pick up on that some of those qualities that aren't immediately apparent.
Yeah, that's sort of the idea. Let it seep in, as it were. Plato talks about that in the Republic, how music sort of seeps into your soul and affects you, and that's how I sort of see it. But we have to watch out. That's where the guardians are. The guardians are watching how it has to do with music, he tells us, because music can affect our soul in imperceptible ways. And so, yeah, that's sort of the idea.
Well, I gotta get a holy recommendation somehow. Okay, I'm gonna be scheming about that. How can I get those? I would love those myself. All right, this has been fantastic. I wish you all the best with your forthcoming course, in addition to the other courses you teach. And I thank you so much for the time you've taken with us today, Dr. Hasler.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, it is always so great to talk to you, and is uplifting, and you've stricken us by ideas as well here today.
Well,
Mary our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, pray for us. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam.